And we are now back online, and now we're gonna have an unusual type of presentation. We're gonna have an hour and a half live coding with asynchronous PHP and ReactPHP. Please meet Marc Morera. Hi, Marc.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, fine. Would you tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, what do you do, and what your today's presentation is going to be about?
Well, in fact, that's my first slide, but I'm going to make a spoiler here. Well, my name is Marc Morera. I'm from Catalonia in Barcelona. And, you know, I'm an architect and I've been a developer on PHP like the last 12 years. And nowadays I'm working so hard in making ReactPHP libraries available for almost everyone on the PHP ecosystem, trying to work like a more business-friendly applications on top of that libraries. And well, my talk is about how to create an API on top of ReactPHP by using a small framework that I've been working on during the last year and a half. And that's it. And in line, I'm going to try to create an application, an API application live here. I'm going to try to code it and make it work.
That's really, really interesting. Why did you choose React? The community has enough tools to allow asynchronous code.
Well, basically because I've been working on PHP, and to be honest, I don't think that is the best approach to change language if you want to reach a more performant numbers. If you're talking about PHP, and I think that we have enough, like you say, we have enough tools to work asynchronously, but we have that tools inside PHP. So that I think that, to be honest, right now I think that you can reach that numbers without going out PHP. So and I think that there is still more much work to do here in that direction, basically because it's going to be good for the PHP environment and the PHP community. You know, an environment, a web environment, there's plenty of PHP projects. So going out of PHP, I don't think it's responsible enough for the community.
Well, I think, Marc, you've intrigued us all, and now you have the floor. Let's see what you have to show.
Okay, well, thank you for having me in that conference. My name is Marc, as I said, and I'm going to talk to you about ReactPHP, but not about ReactPHP itself, but how to build ReactPHP applications on top of a small framework called DriftPHP. So, okay. So I'm Marc, as I said. I'm a software architect based on Barcelona, Catalonia. I'm a trainer at a small project I built last year called PHP Coach, where I trying to teach people how to build applications on top of CQRS. And nowadays that course is more focused on about how to create that software on top of ReactPHP and promises. So I'm the creator of the framework DriftPHP, and on top of that, I'm the creator of an application. It's called Absurd. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. And I'm the organizer of a conference that it's called LoopRun. The first edition of that conference was scheduled for this year, but you know what's the actual situation here. So it's going to be next year. My skills are more focused on PHP, Symfony, more architecture and ReactPHP right now, and you know I have some skills on Git and Docker. So for starting, I think that it's important to tell that this is not a React PHP talk. You know, you will find several React PHP, really good React PHP talks around the world in YouTube, for example. And I don't think that this talk have to be focused on that library. If you want to know a little bit more about that library, you can go and find one talk. So before starting my talk, I want to set up. I want to set small basics on React PHP. Maybe some topics you should be aware of. And the first one is what is an event loop. If you have some experience on Node.js, you will find it a little bit more familiar. So an event loop is just a while true loop that never ends, and inside every loop you will have an array of IO operations that while you don't have that operation result, that while loop will just jump that position, so it makes everything like non-blocking. So after that, there is a object that it's called a promise, and it's nothing more a wrapper of a value that eventually is going to be there. It hasn't to be there. It has not to be there, but eventually it's going to be there. Then that promise, there is a method that it's called then, where you can define an anonymous function that is going to be executed as soon as that value inside the promise is set there. And everything is non-blocking basically because we are working with that event loop. So that event loop is more focused on make all your application work without having all that blocking operations, that it's always that EO operations. So that content table, tabla de contenidos, it's content table in Spanish. I'm sorry about that. The number one point is I'm going to explain from my point of view where are we now, what is the PHP environment working on right now. The second point is where we have to go, or where are we actually going right now. The number three, I'm going to make that demo. And the number four, I'm going to make some tip and tricks about putting DriftPHP or ReactPHP in production. So where are we now? I want to start with that topic that people in PHP itself always say, that PHP is dead. Okay, I don't think that PHP is dead at all. I mean, I think that it has no sense. What I think that PHP in the traditional way we understand it, it's going to be decreasing on the next years, basically because medium and large companies are going to ask a little bit more performant applications. This is basically, the consequence of having an environment that day by day requires us to make more performant applications, like e-commerce, for example, basically because each day we have more customers to serve. So to be honest, having that scenario, we as an architect should start depending less on that scale up, scale down systems with our services replicated. And because of that, there are a lot of companies that are starting to move their code to Python, Golang, or Node.js, basically because they don't find on PHP a mechanism to make that happen. Okay, and that costs money, and that creates a lot of legacy code. I'm sure that many of you have find that story in your companies. So this is a reality. This is not assumptions. This is not theoretical part. This is a reality. Okay. So you as an architect, as a PHP architect, you must know that you have a long road in front of you if you want to improve your PHP skills, improve not only your PHP skills, but your developer skills. So the only thing that you may think that PHP is going to limit you in the future is about paradigm, or not really. I mean, you can really work on several paradigms even in PHP. So my question is, why the PHP community has really stopped on that direction? Why PHP community it's very stable on that momentum where, you know, requests that last 10 milliseconds, it's something acceptable. I mean, 10 milliseconds, it's a lot of time. It allows you to, you know, to serve 100 requests per second, which is not that much. It depends. Depending on the project, this is not a good time. So it's not about libraries, it's about paradigm that we are actually in PHP right now. It's about that people is spending some time, too much time from my point of view, arguing why, for example, Symfony or Laravel is better than each other. Instead of talking about what should be the direction to make PHP language and PHP projects, you know, to jump this next level that it seems so high, but it's not that high, to make that jump, and instead of working with synchronous code, go to asynchronous code and made, you know, applications much more performant. It's instead of staying on that paradigm request response, working within Apache or Nginx. So the really problem here about how we are actually working on PHP, it's that piece of code you're seeing here. It's really simple. You know, we have three operations here. The first one, it's a repository that we are trying to find a user with the ID 123. The second one is a file system request. And the third one is something like the first one, but instead of going to MySQL, for example, we are actually going to Redis. So the problem here with that three lines is that instead, not instead. In that case, we are actually, I don't know if you'll see my cursor, in that point where you create that call to the repository and you wait for having the user and assign the user the instance to that variable, we have a blocking process. That means that during this time, your PHP thread is going to be blocked, is going to be stopped, which means that in terms of resources, you will find that the high percent of your time you are going to be stopped here. Okay, just waiting for having the user. So when I tried to find out how to improve that in the Symfony environment where I've been working during the last many years, to be honest, someone last year told me, well, why don't we go with promises in the domain and infrastructure part while we are using Symfony? So what's the problem here? So I think that question for me, it was an inflection point. And I started trying to dig what was the stopper here in Symfony. So that was the seed of my career in the last 18 months. So let's figure out that we have a small application here, and I'm going to split my application in four parts. The first one is the server one. I'm sure that 99% of you that work on PHP, you know what it's about, configuring an Nginx or Apache service here, how they work. The second one is about our kernel in Symfony, for example, where we receive the request from Nginx or Apache, and we create a kernel, we create a request, and we pass our request to our controller. The third one is our domain. You can include here repository interfaces, our model, our services, whatever. And the fourth part is our infrastructure. Let's say Devel, MySQL, file system, whatever. Okay, I think that you could be familiar with that schema here. So if we go from right to left, we will find that our blocking operations is basically placed on our right part of the diagram. So we will find that each time we create a driver operation, if we work on top of ReactPHP instead of a user, in that case, we are not going to receive an instance, because otherwise we should wait here. Okay, instead of a user, we're going to return a promise. Remember what we tell about a promise, that it's nothing but a wrapper of an eventual object. So calling to the then method inside that promise, we will have a final value inside that promise. So in that case, we are going to receive a user array because we're working with a driver. So after that, we can create a user and return it. So at the end, in that piece of code, we have a promise that eventually inside the promise, we will have a user instance. Okay, we can actually do that in our Symfony projects, right? We can install a driver on top of ReactPHP and that should work, right? So from left to right, the next layer is the domain, where we receive that user promise with a user from the infrastructure layer. In that case, we will have the same user instance, and we could add a small layer here that if we receive an exception from that infrastructure layer, we can transform that exception to a domain exception. But at the end, we will have the same promise with the same user here. So the third step, it's about the kernel one. Okay. In our domain, we can think about our controllers are an entry point of our domain. So we could consider it somehow part of our domain, okay? At least in that example. So if we go to the kernel, we will find that in Symfony, and I think it's going to be much the same that in Laravel, and the 100% of the PHP frameworks nowadays, we will have some kind of lines like this one, okay? First of all, we create a kernel, we create a request, okay? Per each request, we create a new kernel. So this is something that we could really improve here. It's improvable without going with ReactPHP. Somehow you can have some projects that emulate that part without going with ReactPHP 100% if in our domain. But the blocking line here is the third one. Having a kernel and having a request, I want a response. So this is a blocking stuff, basically because you cannot continue with your PHP thread unless you have a response. So this is exactly the same thing that it happens in infrastructure, okay? So this is not truth. We cannot work with a kernel Symfony application even if we go with promises in our infrastructure, okay? So if we want to make some kind of tricky here and make it work, at the end and before returning a response, you have to await. This is some kind of blocking operation that having a promise, you can await for in that case for the user. So yeah, you can think about until here as a asynchronous operations, but in that case, you're going to block anyway. So remember that in Symfony, you have to return always a response, okay? So what happens here? Imagine that you're used to working with Symfony framework and you want to say, okay, I want to try it. I want to make all my applications work on top of ReactPHP and on top of non-blocking operations. Do I have to go outside PHP for something like that? Okay, you don't have to do that, okay? What if I told you that you can work with a non-blocking code using the 100% of your resources? That means that you're not going to wait for anything, okay? What if I told you that even with that, you can serve a request responses in less than 1 millisecond. I have applications on top of that I am actually responding in less than 200 microseconds, which is great, right? I think that are good numbers for website for PHP. And what if I told you that you can actually work with Symfony at the same time? You can work with auto-warring, with the same routing component, with the same event dispatcher component. I mean, like if you were working with Symfony, at least inside your domain. Okay. In that case, I could tell you that in that scenario, the cache is completely useless. So all that cache problems could disappear perfectly. And well, working with that direction, working with that tools, you don't even have to work with Nginx or Apache. It completely disappeared the need of working with that project. So what if I told you that everything that exists already? Okay. Okay. So let's start with an approximation about that that solution here. The main thing that it has to change on Symfony to make us able to work with promises at the same time that the kernel is that our controllers should accept a promise instead of a response. That means that if we return a promise that eventually can handle a response inside, that could be good. And at the same time, we could take that promise and pass it directly to the server. That is actually who is actually handling the event log, which is our, it's we should focus on that. So that diagram could change a little bit. And instead of having a kernel and a server, we could group both of them and creating a server that actually handles a kernel inside. Okay, so creating a server on top of ReactPHP that it's not actually a part of the DriftPHP project, but the DriftPHP server is just a wrapper around the ReactPHP server components. You can create a single kernel. You can rise up the kernel, and at the same time, you can handle all the requests using the same kernel. Okay, we are going to see that in a moment. So what is DriftPHP? DriftPHP is a set of components. Some of them original from the framework. Some of them are just wrappers for actual components from other projects. For example, in ReactPHP itself, you have a HTTP server. Okay, you have a kernel. You have well, I'm talking about ReactPHP components, okay? The HTTP component, the server component, promises component, you will find loop component. We can actually work with Symfony components as well, like the router, the kernel, etc., etc., etc. And we have a kernel on DriftPHP that is actually a plug and play kernel built on top of the Symfony one, but instead of handling all the requests synchronously, it makes the same thing but asynchronously. Okay. Then on the other hand, you have a component that's called server that it's used for creating a server on top of that kernel, and and do what it actually does the HTTP component for ReactPHP. It's just a wrapper, okay, with some kind of most kernel-focused settings inside the server configuration. On the other hand, you will find two buses, the command bus and the event bus. Both are built on top of promises instead of synchronous code. That means that a command bus and event bus, if you want to work with a decentralized structure, service structure like microservices, for example, and you need to add a RabbitMQ adapter, you can work with a asynchronous RabbitMQ adapter built on top of ReactPHP promises. On the other side as well, we have a deval built on top of Doctrine deval that is actually working as well with ReactPHP on top of ReactPHP as SQL adapters. In that moment, we have MySQL, SQLite, and Postgres. and you have more adapters like Redis and RabbitMQ, etc., etc. There is not in that list, but you actually can work with the WebSocket adapter. So you can work with WebSockets at the same time and sharing the same memory space that request response server, which is good, to be honest. Okay, let's start our demo. Okay, I'm going to start. Let's make it happen. First of all, if you want to create, if you want to work on DriftPHP and you want to start from the scratch, you have here a skeleton, which is good because you can create small application, basic application on top of DriftPHP. So let's start with that. Okay. If you want to ask me questions during the presentation, please do that. I don't think if that is possible in that, in that systems, but you can do that. Okay. So I'm cloning the skeleton. You can start the skeleton. I should be able to see here. Okay, my code. Okay, I hope you're seeing properly all my code. So first of all, I'm going to show you what the skeleton looks like on DriftPHP. If you're familiar with Symfony, again, you will find it so easy, and so you will know how to find everything. But in case you don't, I'm going to explain what's several parts of the application. Okay, inside Drift folder, you will find that you have here a kernel. Oh, before that, I need to compose and install. In the meanwhile, you'll find that you will have a kernel. That kernel, it's extending the asynchronous kernel instead of the kernel for Symfony. But inside that, you will find that the code is exactly the same. That's the code you will find to any kernel on a Symfony project. Okay, we have to wait for that. Inside the config folder, you will find that you have the same bootstrap file that you will find in Symfony projects. Okay, you will have the same bundle list inside Symfony projects. You will have the same behavior here. Okay, you should have updated all the dependencies here. Let me check. Reload from disk. Okay, I need to change as well the PHP. Okay. Okay. So as I told, bundled PHP, it works exactly the same that in Symfony. Then you have a routes file. It's exactly the same that in Symfony. You will have to create here some routes for your application, and you will have a services YAML. It's exactly the same that in Symfony again. Okay, you will be able to create your services, work with auto wiring, exactly the same. Okay, so what is our entry point? Well, exactly the Symfony. Inside source, you have a controller, you have a default controller. In that case, we will have a default controller. Inside the default controller, we have an invoke. This is why I can use invoke, because I'm going to use one method, one route per controller. So if you go to Drift routes, you will find that when I define my controller, I only have to define the namespace without any kind of method. Okay. And inside my invoke method, I am accepting a request as an entry parameter, and I'm not really returning a response, right? In Symfony, I would have to do something like that. Okay. But guys, this is not Symfony. I don't have to do that. I can do that, to be honest. I mean, if I return a response, the kernel is going to wrap that response in a promise, but I can return a promise as well. So the first code was really good as well. So let's try it. Let's check that it's actually working. If you work with that skeleton and with any project built on top of the DriftPHP server, you will be able to create a server instance by using the run inside the vendor bean server. Then you have to create the entry point IP, and with the port. And it's going to start listening to that port. So having that server run, I can do something like that. Okay. Simple. The first time is going to list a little bit more because it has to generate all the services instance inside the kernel, as you can see. So the first one is 5 milliseconds. There is a bundle I built for doing something like that, like the first before accepting the first request, we should be able to build everything. Okay. So the first one is not a fresh request, but the second one, that's the response time. Okay, I can do whatever I want here. Okay. Oh no, this is not good. Okay, and even I can do that. AV Apache benchmark. I want to create 1,000 requests with a concurrency of 15 to localhost 9999. Okay, and I have that the 90% of the requests are less than 10 milliseconds. Remember, this is a concurrency of 100 of 15 requests. You can try the same thing in Symfony, and I want to see your results. Okay, so 95 microseconds. That are really good times. Okay. So our demo is I'm going to show you how to create a small API on top of ReactPHP. As I told you, it's exactly the same that in Symfony. So first of all, we should change that name, or we could create a new controller. And instead of default controller, and because we are going to create a small project that is like a key value controller, okay, we can change and we can put here put value controller. Okay, that put value controller. Okay, I'm going to receive an ID. In fact, we're going to work directly the Symfony way here. So I can receive here a key instead of, okay. And I'm going to respond a promise. Why I'm going to respond a promise? Basically because right now we are going to implement an adapter that it's not for Redis or for MySQL, but we could do that. So that means that eventually that element that we take from the database, it's not going to be really it's going to be in promise. Okay, and it happens the same that in get, it happens the same that in put. We cannot, if we want to be sure that we create a response as soon as the put value finishes, then we have to work with promises instead of final values. So in that case, first of all, we have a key. So to step forward, we need to create a repository here, right? We are going to work in memory because we are on ReactPHP, so we can create a repository built in memory, right? Like that. So just in space, it's going to be domain. Okay. So inside we are going to have a private values. It's a key value. So we can have a put value. We have a string key. We have a string value. Okay. We are going to have a promise interface. I think something is not working properly. Public function. Why it's not working? I have an issue here. Oh, exactly. So if we want to put a value, that action is idempotent, so we can something like that. Values of key is value. And we have to initialize our internal array. So because we have to return a promise, we can easily return an empty promise. Something like that. Okay. If we want to get a value, and instead of working with domain exceptions, we can do something like that and get value. We only need a key, right? And we want to return a promise. In that case, that promise is going to be a promise handling a value inside, okay? And we can return itself an exception when the value is not inside. In that case, we could return a promise interface with a value, okay? So a string or an exception, okay? And add here, use exception. Okay. In that case, if we set these values, we can't really return here, or we can't throw an exception itself because we are actually working with promises. Instead of that, the ReactPHP way is return reject. Exception. Not found. Okay. Otherwise, we can return resolve these values of key. Okay, we are not going to work with delete because it's not. I mean, it's like do something that we are actually testing here. So here, because we are actually working the same way that Symfony, we can inject our repository. So remember that is actually a testing thing. It's not something I would say to make in production. Instead of injecting a adapter, you should inject here a interface in order to be able to change the adapter. So we have here a constructor. And in that case, because we have a key, we just this repository get value. Okay, we have a key. So if we want to do something, as soon as we have the value, we need to make a then. We are going to receive a value. And because this is only called when we make a resolve thing instead of a reject, we can be sure that inside here we are receiving always a string, never an exception. Okay. So what the theoretical part here? We need to return a promise. Okay, we can write it here. Return a promise interface that always has to have inside a response. Okay, in that case, we can work at the same time with response for Symfony or response for its ReactPHP. Okay, in that case, we are going to work with response for Symfony. So in that case, I'm going to return new response. First value is a content with a value, and the second is 200. So what do we have to respond in that method? A promise with a response. We already have it. So we can return here. If we want to change, for example, the exception that is passed from the repository, we could say then function, instead of then otherwise, sorry, function, and we would receive here a exception. You can cast it here, the exception you want to catch. Sorry, because I have the micro in front of me and I can see my keyword. Okay, in that case, we could take the exception and return new response, okay, with an exception get message and a 404. Okay, so that should work, right? Because we can only put, oh, this is a put. No, let's change that controller to get. I was wrong. Okay, and we're working with the get. Let's try. That always fail, of course, because we don't have anything inside here. So what we have to do it, like in Symfony application, is going to roots, okay, create our root. That's going to be a get key value. Path is going to be like a rest one, values. Key. The controller is going to have, it's going to be get key, get key controller. And we have to define our service, basically, like in Symfony as well. So it's called domain in memory key value repository. That's it. Because it has not any configuration, we can do something like that. Let's see if we need to change something here. Okay, it seems that everything's going to be okay. Okay, something is broken. Root not found because it has to be. Like in Symfony, you can do. We could see the value here, the root here, values / key. So we're going to start it again. Start it again. Here. Values key1. That's another thing. Okay. Get key controller. It's not get key controller. It's get value controller. Exactly. Okay. We don't have a key. We can call as many times as we want, and we have. Okay. Because we are actually doing something. Okay. Oh. Root not found. Why root not found? Okay, not found. Root not found. Oh, this is basically because we are returning a 404. Instead of that, we could return a 400. That could be the rate. Okay. Perfect. Oh, what's next? Instead of, we can do the put value here. We are going to make it simple. Instead of working with body, we are going to make it simple. So the put value here is going to have the same injection because we're going to work with the same repository, but inside the roots, we are going to have a put value, and it's going to be something like that. Because it is important, it's going to be, oh, remember to set the methods here. Because otherwise, it's not going to work. And instead of something like that, let's say, and this is not something doable at all, but let's make it work. Okay, for that example. Again, this is not the way to do it, okay, but we are trying not how to make REST applications, but how to work with React, PHP, and Drift. So in that case, we're going to make it put value controller. And inside value controller, we are going to receive at the same time the key and the value. Okay. Again, I repeat for the last time, do not do something like that on production. Okay. So in that case, instead of doing something like that, we are going to make this repository put value, key, and value. So what do we have to return? A response. Eventually, yes, eventually, as always. Remember that in DriftPHP and in ReactPHP, if you work with IO operations, everything is going to be eventually, okay? So eventually, if we receive nothing, okay, basically because this is a put, you don't have to return nothing. You can actually, even if you don't return nothing, you can actually wait for that operations to finish. Okay, what could be convenient with our scenario, and this is the case. And as soon as you finish with the put value, then you can return response. Okay, that's it. It's exactly the same that in Symfony, but instead of working with responses, you work with promises of a response. So we don't have to define anything else. We have a put value here, so I think that we could run again. So if we put it with value 1, okay, something happened here. Put not found. Did we click cache? The book wrote there. Okay. Why is not working? Value is key value, right? It's a put. Okay, perfect. It worked, right? So what if I make a get? Exactly. That's the point. Okay. As always, you can make a AV, and okay, let's go with concurrency of 100 with a local host 9999 values A1. Okay, let's say 75% of the queries that it's like what you should take as reference for production, it's less than 10 milliseconds. I'm talking about a concurrency of 10. If we go to 200, exactly the same. If we go to 500, going to 5,000, okay, something. When we go with that concurrency, some requests just lost. Which is good, which doesn't really matter because you're not going to have that numbers on production. The important part is that one. Okay, even with a concurrency of 500, which is insane, by the way, you will find a 10 milliseconds return of a request. Okay, let's return to slides. Okay, perfect. So what in production? That is very interesting. Remember that deploying that project on production, you don't really need a patch of Nginx. That, remember that word. You don't have to need. You don't need it. If you want to put that because of a a reversed proxy or whatever, you can do that, but you don't have to need it. Okay. So remember, because you're working with PHP, the ReactPHP, it's the server itself. You are actually working with one core, with one CPU core at the same time, and you have to think that the RAM is finite. Okay, so for example, if you are working with an stream and you want to return all your users by using a stream response, you have to take care that you are not going to load all your users at the same time, because basically all your users are going to remain in memory. What you don't want to do that, because in the same memory scenario, you will have like 1,000 requests being resolved at the same time. So if you do that 10 times, then maybe your system is going to crash doing memory overflow. Okay, so you have to be really, really, really aware about your RAM consumption. So because of your I/O operations are not going to be blocking, then you don't really need to work with queues if you want to separate writes and reads. If you don't want to affect the performance of your applications because of the writes operations, by using ReactPHP and DriftPHP, you don't have to do that. Okay, so in that case, in a Symfony project, working with writes could be the real problem. But in DriftPHP, the real problem comes not with the writes, but with the of code that requires a lot of CPU usage. In that case, you would, for example, if you have a hard block that needs to perform hard operations, and you need to do something very hard in 1 second. During that 1 second, you will have the thing that you will find is that any request is going to be able to proceed. Okay, that's the point. It's going to block the whole process doing that 1 second stuff. So in that case, and by using ReactPHP, what you could do is take that process and do it asynchronously by using queues. So in that case, queues are really useful as well, but not for the same scenario. What else? Well, each server instance, it opens HTTP port. So in production, what you have to do is create several instances of the same port and balance across that instances. Well, it's exactly the same. And the DriftPHP server are actually serving as well static content. So if you want to work with Nginx by serving static content, you can actually do without Nginx, because you can work with a CDN, for example. Okay. Another thing important is the exceptions have a request scope, so it's not going to paralyze the whole server. It's not going to crash the whole server if you throw an exception. Okay. One thing that you can have in production is that you can lose I/O connections. For example, MySQL. This can happen. It's not usual, but can happen. And recover for an I/O connection is hard. It's not easy at all. So yeah, it could be a problem here. And the DriftPHP kernel adds 2 new kernel events for Symfony that are called preload and shutdown. The first one is it's dispatched before the HTTP port start accepting requests. And the second one is thrown before shutting down the server when it receives a signal. Okay. So, my point of view, I don't use any project on production until it becomes stable for some months. It includes DriftPHP. If you ask me, can I do a project for production for next month on top of DriftPHP? I would say no, don't do that. I can do because I know everything how it works, but hopefully you don't. It's normal. But in my case, I have DriftPHP working on production since in some months ago, to be honest, like it more or less than 1 year. The project is called Episearch. It's a search engine on top of ReactPHP, DriftPHP, and Elasticsearch. It's been up on production by using Kubernetes pods and have been up and running during like 4 or 5 months until the first time. They have been running without errors. And my round trip in production, it's less than 60 milliseconds, including internet and Elasticsearch, which is good and which is something that, in particular of a search engine, it's a must. Okay, you will find the first beta version of the DriftPHP project on the 1st of January, assuming that it's going to contain the documentation as well. You can follow that project on GitHub and Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to work with containers by using the same thing here, and it's really easy. You don't have to, you don't have to worry about absolutely anything. You will find that inside skeleton. You have a Docker file. Okay, this is basically taking a DriftPHP base that contains everything you need to run a ReactPHP application on top of PHP. It's actually working with PHP 7.4, and I started doing some testing with PHP 8, which is actually, from my perspective, it's exactly the same performance. So it really doesn't change much anything. What it does is a component installed inside the container. It copies the Docker folder to be able to access them from the root of the file system. And if we go to server entry point, you will find that it's really easy. In fact, you don't have to do anything else. Oh, there's something important, and it's important because it uses a PHP Watcher by Sergey, by the way, which I appreciate so much. Instead of running the server, you can watch it. Okay, so if I change anything inside the controller, in fact, if I change anything inside the controller, it restarts the controller. Okay. This is good because you can work with a reset server. You don't have to close and start again once and again. Okay, so in that case, instead of doing that watch, we're going to run because it's for production. We are going to listen the port 8000. Okay, and this is important because we have to expose that port here, which we actually are doing something like that. So first of all, we have to build that image. So Docker build. We are going to tag that image like a okay. And once we have that image built, we can run one particular instance of that image. We can create a container. We have to do something like that to make it stoppable with Control-C. We need to open a port. So in that case, I'm going to work with 9999, listening inside a 8000. So the image is phpfest.demo. That should work. So it's not in my local host. Now it's running inside a Docker container. So if I make that put here and I make that get here, it works properly. Instead of that, I can make that and it's not found. And as you can see here, inside the container, you have the same responses that in localhost. Basically, and with some configuration here, you would really deploy that production like this. That's it. There's no difference between configuration in localhost or in production. You can have here more, like quiet, for example. Okay. instead of something like that, we can build it again to make it quiet. So we don't want, okay, we don't want anything to be print in the output. So we can put here, we can get it, but in our server, there's nothing here. So that could be more convenient for production. Easy peasy, as you can see. So that's it. I think that as I told you, this is not a difficult part of DriftPHP. It's not difficult itself. The difficult part to understand, the difficult part that you should focus if you want to dig in how to make React PHP applications, it's React PHP itself. Not because the project, to be honest, it's one of the best documented projects I've ever seen, not only in PHP, but worldwide, no matter the technology. You will find that everything is really, really easy to understand. But the hard part is not to understand the documentation, but to understand how that particular paradigm works. Because some parts of the request response paradigm it changes if you come from Symfony. So you need to adapt your mind to understand that all part of your application is going to be resolved immediately, but it's always eventually, and that could dig into some errors in the implementation. But that's it. If you go for it, I think that it's easy, and at the end you will be able to produce that kind of applications for production. So yeah, if you have questions, I'm going to be around here. I return my. I love that effect.
Thanks, Mark. This was an interesting show and demo and presentation. And the first question is, why was Symfony components were chosen as part of the DriftPHP?
Well, my original, I come from Symfony. And I was working with Symfony basically because I consider some components of Symfony really the best components for that. For example, routing. I think that the Symfony routing component, it's very easy to understand. It's very easy to work with. For example, the event dispatcher. Yeah, maybe they're not the most sophisticated components, but for me, I think that Symfony community is a big one, and one of the approaches for the project is try to make people understand that React PHP is not that hard as they could think, and in order to propose that change, I think that it's important to take one part of the community and make things happen easily for them. In my case, I chose Symfony community. I tried as well to make Symfony, core group part of that, but I understand now that this is not going to be interesting for them because they build the ecosystem of Symfony on top of blocking operations, like could be Doctrine or VM, a lot of components that actually are blocking, a lot of bundles inside the community that are actually blocking. So this is kind of fork of Symfony, providing more efficient request response paradigm. But yeah, Symfony for me, I think it's good. It's the best for me. So taking components from this project, I think that it's the best decision.
В чате зрители спрашивают, что насчет управления памятью в DriftPHP?
We have a question in chat about memory management in DriftPHP, as this all does not restart and constantly running, so maybe we should expect some memory leakage. Are there any metrics or health checks for?
Okay. Yeah. Again, it is important to understand that we as an architects, we should take care about our application, and this includes CPU usage and memory usage. Okay, React PHP itself doesn't have memory leaks. I think that when people talk about memory leaks, they are really talking about parts of the application that takes local parameters that never are clean. Garbage collector in PHP can work better or worse, but at the end it works. So if you have local storage and you have a lot of functions at the end, they're going to be clean somehow, depending on some parameters. But you need to take care about what do you save locally, because it's going to consume local memory. You could have problems around memory. Yeah, I've been encountered a lot of issues in my code that were actually working saving parts of the application inside memory. Like for example, one of the things I encountered is that working with a request, how do you say? What's the name of that class? Kind of request collection. If you work with Symfony, then if you work with sub requests, the requests are stored internally. So what I found is that all the requests were stored internally because you only create one kernel. So this is one of the issues that you can find when you work with React PHP, and in that case with Symfony. Okay, request context, I don't remember what was the name of the class. Request context, I think.
Let's continue with the topic of monitoring. I saw you tweeting about send and Unirel, or those should be implementations for React PHP, right? How are things going there?
Oh, I didn't understand the question. Can you repeat it, please?
We now have tools to monitor the applications in prod, like Sentry or New Relic, to check the state of the application.
Okay.
Do you have any integration with them, or it's only done manually?
Easy peasy, easy response. No. the thing here is that it's not that easy. For example, one of the things that I've been having in mind during the last year is how to integrate that with New Relic. And I think that it's not going to be possible as soon as I can imagine to make that integration. It's not going to be possible with the PHP library that they are actually providing. Basically because they are considering the PHP memory space as a one request. Okay, so they don't really care about where are you using one function and where are you using in the other one. They assume that all the functions inside a PHP memory space are basically part of the same request, which doesn't really, it's not exactly the behavior, the expected behavior in React PHP. In React PHP, if you want to make the same New Relic calls, you should be able to split your memory space between requests, which is not easy. I don't really know how to do that right now in React PHP and Drift. I think that this is a very important part of the application because almost everyone is actually using one service like that. Integration with that could be very useful for the project. But right now, I'm not really sure if it's doable with the tools we have right now. I think that this could be the next big step for the project.
Well, okay, let's then develop this topic and follow up on this. Imagine I am a crazy guy that I'm courageous and I would like to use Drift. Okay, I need to be prepared not to not have New Relic. So what are my other limitations? Some storages or some services?
You will find a lot of limitations. This is why I told that a project like that is not something that you can put on production and that's it. Okay, this is a new step on PHP, not the project itself, because this is just another project, but going asynchronous in PHP, it's just a big step. You should think about it properly. So, for example, one of the stoppers we had, and it properly, by the way, some months ago was, what about if I want to use a deval? I can't use a deval because there was not a deval. So we built a deval on top of Doctrine, which is good because you can work with a query builder, for example, or with this part of the Doctrine deval project. It uses all the power that the deval has, actually, the Doctrine deval. But because we have to work with adapters built on top of ReactPHP, that means that we can really use a small part of the power of the library. That means that you can only use the adapters built on the ReactPHP that you can find out there. So we have a MySQL, a Postgres, and a SQLite. SQLite is important because you can test it locally in SQLite by using memory, the memory subadapter, which is good because I think that a big high percent of the people using the deval are actually working with MySQL or Postgres. But in the future, we will be able to add more adapters and to increase that power provided by the Doctrine deval. But you could find here a limitation. For example, if you want to work with an adapter for SQL server, for example, you will not be able to do that. Or the New Relic, that could be a limitation. That could be a limitation, for example, if you want to work with Gearman. I'm not sure that there's an adapter for Gearman on top of ReactPHP. You could find some limitations, but I think that could be the same limitations that could have Symfony at the beginning. So limitations exist because they are opportunities for people to develop more and more libraries on top of that. So yeah, we are on that moment. And that's it. We only need some time to increase the library layer for the project. The good part is that if you can reuse Symfony bundles if they don't work with I/O operations.
And currently, what are you working on? What part takes your time? Is it server or the drivers on top of the PHP for the ecosystem?
Well, to be honest, I'm not spending time on components, basically because I'm spending time off my project. Open source is perfectly. It's a perfectly thing to spend some time. But to be honest, I've been working with PHP open source libraries since 10 years ago, and I have never earned a single euro for that. So, which is interesting. Open source is free, and people understand that it's free, and that's it. So yeah, I think that I have a son right now, and I have to start thinking about how to earn some money using open source and creating open source. So right now I'm trying to make Apisearch a big player. I think that would be very good for Drift as well, because I could create like a small investment, regular investment for the project and for ReactPHP as well. And my work on DriftPHP right now is trying to improve the documentation, but as well trying to make that work on production by using API Search. To be honest, I'm so happy because I've not encountered any really limitation by using DriftPHP components at all. I've started working with streams, which is amazing. Right now, the DriftPHP kernel accepts both request streams and response streams. So you can communicate with the server by using a stream on both sides, okay, on both directions, which is really, 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 really amazing. So yeah, consider that I'm just working with DriftPHP every day right now. I mean, 365 days per year working with DriftPHP. So I think that could work.
Look, if to say it bluntly, DriftPHP is based on two projects, ReactPHP and Symfony. Symfony is too big to notice DriftPHP, and ReactPHP is a compact community. How do you talk to them like ReactPHP? If you lack some tools, maybe they help you fix it or add. Do you have any collaboration with a asynchronous PHP community?
Yeah, I don't have any communication with Symfony people. It's interesting how they don't really have interest on that, which is good. I think that I've chosen my own path, and I'm just a no one. To be honest, I'm just a no one making some work on one project, so it's okay. That could be affected to me some years ago, but it's not the case anymore. From the perspective of ReactPHP, I understand that people working on ReactPHP have exactly the same problem that I have, that they have created a project like ReactPHP that it's quite amazing. It's quite sophisticated for our times in PHP. It's for me, from my perspective, it's a unique project. But again, the project has more than 8 years, and monetizing all that time is quite difficult. So I understand that sometimes communication is not as good as we would want. Basically because they have their own work, I have my own work, and when spending some time on open source, it's hard. So communication is even harder. I try to maintain some contact with ReactPHP guys. I in the past I've need some help with some part of the application, and I don't need that help anymore because I think that I have acquired some experience on the project. But yeah, I think that I have to build my own community. That own community, it's going to be a ReactPHP community as well. So I want all the DriftPHP community to be involved in the ReactPHP community as well. I think that both are related, but from my perspective, they are both different things. And I think that are different users. Some users could be interested in DriftPHP without entering so much on ReactPHP, and some people could be interested in ReactPHP and without any kind of interest on any framework. It's the same thing that happened with Doctrine and Symfony. You could be interested in Symfony, working with Doctrine, and not interested in the Doctrine community itself. And you could be interested in Doctrine community, but not interested in the Symfony community itself. So it's okay. I've learned to make it flow, everything, and that's it.